Hello, I'm Ivan Adams and this is my presentation to the local history group on the history of railways in Yorkshire. This is the list of topics that I will cover in the talk. We'll start with the beginning of railways in Yorkshire. Then we'll look at some of the developments during the 19th century. Following that, the 20th century, changes and major events that took place. Privatisation followed that, and then we'll look at the position as it is now and possibilities for the future. Then we'll turn to our local railways around this area, some of the other closed and remaining branch lines in Yorkshire, and the heritage railway lines that still exist. How it all began. Prior to the railways, wagons were pulled by horses on wooden tracks called wagonways. Railways, however, used iron or steel rails fixed into wooden and later concrete sleepers laid along a track bed. Initially, railways used horsepower to move the wagons. It was the invention of the steam engine and steam locomotive by Richard Trevithick in 1802 that led to the building of true railways. The first steam railway for public use was the Stockton to Darlington, designed by George Stephenson and opened in 1825. However, there was an earlier railway in Yorkshire before then. In 1812, the Middleton Railway, near Leeds, was the first commercial railway to use steam locomotives, replacing an earlier wagonway. It was used to transport coal from Middleton Colliery to Leeds. Initially built to a non-standard track gauge, in 1881 it was converted to the standard gauge, 1435 mm between rails. In 1960, the Middleton Railway became the first standard gauge railway to be run by volunteers. The impact on the social and economic life due to the arrival of railways in Yorkshire was, as everywhere, hugely significant. These journey times for York to London show how quickly the journey was reduced from days to hours. The ability to move goods by train had a huge impact on trade, made fresh food more accessible across the country, and improved the lives of people generally. One of the most famous, or perhaps it should be infamous, names connected with railways in York is George Hudson. Hudson was elected to York City Council in 1835, became Lord Mayor in 1837. His political opponent was the Liberal Joseph Rowntree. Hudson became chairman of the York and North Midland Railway and bought land and, allegedly, votes to keep his rival Manchester and Leeds Railway out of York. In 1849, Hudson was expelled from York City Council following discovery of illegal share dealing. George Lehman was a contemporary of George Hudson. Both have a street in York named after them. Lehman represented York as a Liberal MP and was a defender of York's antiquities in the face of civic vandalism. He participated in the investigations into Hudson's illegal share dealing and succeeded Hudson as chairman of the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway in 1849. In 1854, three major railway companies, the York, Newcastle and Berwick, the York and North Midland, the Leeds Northern, together with the smaller Moreton and Driffield, merged to form the North Eastern Railway Company, with its headquarters in York, now the Grand Hotel. Several other smaller railways joined the NER in the following decades. This shows part of the tile map of the railway network in North East England, which is displayed at the railway station in York and also at the National Railway Museum. Here is the emblem or logo of the North Eastern Railway, formed by the merger of the other railway companies in the region. Here's the station hotel at York around 1900. The original hotel opened in 1853 and was named Royal after Queen Victoria's visit in 1849. The new hotel opened in 1878. Cost of staying at the hotel around 1900. Breakfast continental 1 shilling and sixpence or 2 shillings with meat. Dinner 2 shillings and sixpence or 3 shillings in a private room. Beds from 1 shilling and sixpence to 2 shillings and sixpence. Boot cleaning sixpence. The hotel is now called the Principal Hotel. This is York's first station, showing the minster in the background and the city walls on the left. In order to build the station, a large hole was cut into the city walls. No listed status for the walls in those days. Here's a map of the station area as it was inside the walls. The access hole through the walls remains, although the railway was removed many years ago. The area is currently under development as luxury apartments named Hudson Quarter, possibly without knowledge of his downfall. Here's the interior of the new station, built in 1877 outside the walls, which is the one we use today. Close to the present station is the Railway Institute building. Opened in 1889, the Railway Institute provided educational and recreational activities for the railway workers of York. In 1926, the redundant carriage building workshops were converted to a large gymnasium, used today as badminton courts. The picture on the right is a 1925 view of the carriage works. Now this is just a small selection of the many types of locomotives that were used in Yorkshire. First is the Aerolite, built in Leeds in 1851, although the photo is from a later period. Here are two more types of early locomotive, photographed at York Station in 1905. This one's not the usual steam locomotive, it's a petrol-electric rail car, early 20th century, pictured here at Filey Station. One of the most famous examples of railway architecture is Ribblehead Viaduct on the Settle and Carlisle line. Some more railway architecture. Railway stations, mostly as they were in the 1950s, although the Leeds one is in the 1900s. Now, as a short diversion, I'm going to take a brief look at some other methods of public transport closely related to railways. Firstly, the tram. The main difference between railways and trams is that tram tracks are built into a roadway, used by other traffic, whereas a railway is used exclusively by trains. Most major cities in Yorkshire had, and Sheffield now does have, trams. These photographs show the trams in York, Bradford, Leeds, and also Leeds rather later in the period 1953. Another variation on a railway is the funicular, often built, as here in Scarborough, to gain access to the beach from the cliffs above. There were 5 in Scarborough, although only 2 remain. The Central Tramway from 1880, originally operated by steam, and the South Cliff Lift, 1875, originally operated by a system of water tanks and pumps. Both are now electrically operated. The funicular principle is the same, however, with a system of pulleys controlling the descent of one tram whilst the other ascends. This GNR poster from the early 20th century advertises the merits of a day trip to Skegness, not quite in Yorkshire, from London at a cost of 3 shillings, which is about £16 in today's money. The current price of a standard return is £165, £80 off peak, which is an increase in real terms of over 900%. The advertisement itself is quite well known historically, commissioned by the GNR in 1908 from the artist John Hassell. During the 20th century, railways in Yorkshire were subject to many impacts and changes. The 2 world wars had a huge impact on the railways in Yorkshire, and in 1923 the companies were consolidated into the Big Four: the LNER, the LMS, the GWR and Southern. In 1948 all of the railways, or almost all, were nationalised into publicly owned British Railways. After that, steam was gradually converted to diesel and electrification followed. Privatisation of railways took place towards the end of the last century, and we'll now look at the position as it is and possibilities for the future. In April 1942, York suffered a devastating raid from the Luftwaffe. It was one of a number aimed at Britain's most historic cities, in retaliation for the RAF's raid on Lübeck. These were known as the Baedeker raids, after the author of the German guidebook which listed the historic cities. Among those killed in the raid was railway foreman William Milner, who was trying to get medical supplies to help the wounded. This plaque at York Station commemorates his bravery. The Railways Act of 1921 consolidated almost all of the existing railway companies into 4 large ones: the Great Western, the Southern, the London Midland and Scottish, and the London and North Eastern, which covered all of Yorkshire. 4 of the major companies that joined to form the LNER were the North Eastern, the Great Northern, the Midland, and the Lancashire and Yorkshire. And here's a route map of the LNER in 1923, when the new company was formed. It shows the East Coast Main Line through Doncaster, Selby and York, and several branch lines and other lines in the area. Sir Nigel Gresley was the famous designer of locomotives for the LNER, and probably the best known of all steam locomotive designers. His designs include the Flying Scotsman and Mallard. He's pictured here in a portrait and in two photos showing him alongside his locomotives. And here's his most famous locomotive, Flying Scotsman, in its LNER livery. Some more locomotives from the mid-20th century. On the left, an A2 Pacific leaving York, and on the right, a Gresley B-17 on its way to Hull. Both pictures from the 50s and 60s. Now this is Tornado, built as recently as 2010. All originals of this type were scrapped, so Tornado was built as a replica. This was at its first outing on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. And here's a picture showing locomotives inside York's Roundhouse, which is now part of the National Railway Museum. And here's a few more, all now safely stored at the National Railway Museum in York. A 19th century Great Northern locomotive. An electric locomotive, which was used on the Sheffield-Manchester route in the 1950s and 60s, which was then closed. And probably the second most famous locomotive of all, Mallard, which still holds the world speed record for a steam locomotive. Mallard is one of Gresley's A4 Pacific class, of which 35 were built and 6 still survive. In 2013, all 6 were assembled at the National Railway Museum for a great gathering. Mallard was of course already resident. 3 more were brought from railways in Britain and 2 from the USA and Canada. The railways were nationalised in 1948. This brought the previous Big Four companies under public ownership with the name British Railways. Here is the totem logo used for station nameplates. Each region used the same pattern but in different colours. Yorkshire was within the North Eastern region of British Railways, merged with the Eastern region in 1967, but retained the name North Eastern and the orange colour. British Railways produced holiday guides for each of the regions. This is my own copy of the guide for the North East from 1949. The guides included many advertisements for holiday accommodation, as well as railway maps and pictures of places of interest. Here are 2 of the many advertisements in the 1949 guide. The Grand Hotel is described as Scarborough's largest and finest modern hotel. Golf, fishing and riding were recommended activities, as well as dances in the hotel's beautiful ballroom. On the right is a more modest establishment in Bridlington, but with hot and cold running water in the bedrooms and a maid to look after children. Rooms were from 17 shillings and sixpence a day, all inclusive. These are 2 of the maps from the 1949 guide. The one on the left shows the Yorkshire Dales area, and on the right the Yorkshire Moors and the coast. Note how many small railways there were then. Most of these were closed in the 1960s. These electric locomotives were built mainly for mainline traffic. The top left is a Deltic Class 55 and the top right is a Class 31. both pulling coaches in the blue-grey livery of British Rail. Diesel-electric locomotives use diesel engines to drive electric motors that provide the traction. Below left is a diesel multiple unit, DMU, and on the right the later high-speed train, HST, with two locomotives, one at each end. The HST was a very successful type, and many were used on main lines until very recently. Unlike other European countries that electrified their main railway lines following World War II, Britain, as usual, must be different, built many more steam locomotives up till 1968. The last one was called Evening Star, and this was followed by the introduction of diesels. The West Coast Main Line was electrified in the 1960s, but the East Coast Main Line had to wait until the 1990s before being electrified. From 1965, British Railways adopted the brand British Rail. The British Rail double arrow logo is formed of two interlocked arrows showing the direction of travel on a double-track railway. It is still used today by rail delivery groups' jointly managed service for issuing tickets across the country. Following the privatisation of the utilities, the railways were privatised in the 1990s. Originally, the track and overall infrastructure was sold to a new company in 1996 called Rail Track, but taken over by the government again in 2002 and renamed Network Rail, following a financially disastrous crash at Hatfield. Rail services have been operated by several different companies as franchise operations regulated by the Office of Rail and Road. Many new train liveries appeared on our railways following privatisation. And these are the companies currently operating franchises in Yorkshire. Arriva, subsidiary of Deutsche Bahn, operates Northern Rail and Cross Country. First Group, based in Scotland, operates Hull Trains and TransPennine, and the Department for Transport operates LNER, previously operated by Virgin and National Express. This graph shows how the use of railways by passengers increased rapidly during the late 19th and earliest 20th century. It then shows how it declined over the latter part of the 20th century. However, it has now increased significantly during the 21st century. What about the possible future of railways? Will there be more high-speed trains? Will there be more electrification? And will we see any reopening of some of the old lines that have vanished? This is pure speculation, at this stage anyway. Turning our attention now to three of our very local railways, all gone now except for a small remnant of the Derwent Valley. Our nearest station to Stockton-on-the-Forest was Wart Hill, which was originally named Stockton-on-the-Forest. Wart Hill was on the York, Market Wheaton and Beverley line, which opened to Market Wheaton in 1847 and Beverley in 1865. The line was a victim of the Beeching Acts and was closed in 1965. The lower left photo is from the Stockton-on-the-Forest History Group's publication In Days Gone By, The station sign, totem, is a replica in our garden on the old railway track. The picture on the right is a more recent photograph of the station house. And this is a small, very small, N-gauge modern railway that I have made to provide a simple impression of what the station might have looked like about 60 years ago. The layout and the buildings are not accurate. It is a work in progress. This is the weighbridge at Warthill, now part of the coal yard owned by Martin Alderton, which Joy Mosley and I visited at the beginning of this year. Probably the very last timetable for the line, which is supplied by John Chambers. By this time, Warthill and Haltby stations had already closed, and there were no stops between Earswick and Stamford Bridge. These photos, including the photo of a photo on the top right, were taken when Michael Ellsworth paid a visit to his home village here in Stockton-on-the-Forest last year. Michael's father was the station master at Warthill, and Michael and I spent a delightfully nostalgic day together exploring parts of the route of the railway. Fangfoss is now a caravan park, and that's Michael taking a photo. Another railway featured in the book In Days Gone By is the Sand Hutton Light Railway. This was a narrow gauge line running from Warthill Station via Sand Hutton to Bossall. It existed for a few years only during the 1920s and 1930s. These photos are from the internet and from a book by Martin Bairstow on railways of East Yorkshire. On the internet I found this 1922 LNER advertisement for a special train from York to Warthill, connecting with the Sand Hutton line for an August bank holiday fete at Sand Hutton Hall. These photos were taken by John Chambers, who has kindly agreed to include them in my presentation. They show John on the SHLR locomotive Sinolda at the National Railway Museum, and the same locomotive alongside City of Truro, showing the difference in size. Also shown are some pictures of the narrow gauge rail section compared with the standard gauge, and a replica wagon. The Sand Hutton Light Railway was used commercially for, among other things, transport of bricks from Claxton Brickworks. This is a picture of the brickworks and one of the original bricks. Note the reversed N on the brick. Alongside this is a stack of replica bricks. The Derwent Valley Light Railway was, and the small section that remains still is, a standard gauge railway, 1435mm between rails. It was designated light because it was built under the Light Railways Act of 1896. Before then, each new railway required a specific Act of Parliament, making it costly and time-consuming. This map of the line shows it at its present extent, running all the way from York Layerthorpe via Osbaldwick, Merton, Dunnington, Elvington, Weldrake, Thorganby, Skipwith, and then joining the Selby Market Wheaton line at Cliff Common. A selection of pictures from the DVLR book Rails Along the Derwent at various periods and places. The opening day in 1913, Alvington Station after closure presumably in 1967, a Ford rail car, and a train at Cliff Common in the 1950s. And here's what remains of the DVLR. The top left photo is from the same book, soon after the revival of a short remnant of the line at Merton, part of the Farming Museum. It now runs only on summer Sundays, and the other three photos were taken when I visited last September on the last day of the season. A number of branch lines escaped the beaching axe and remain in use today. Here is a list of some in Yorkshire, including one, the Pontefract line, which is a so-called ghost line because it remains only as a skeleton service, one train a day, only in each direction. Apparently there's a group of railway enthusiasts known as ghosties who make a hobby of travelling on these ghost lines. Here's a photo I took at Danby Station on the Esk Valley line last year, showing a Northern Rail train to Whitby entering the station. Many more lines exist, in part at least, as heritage railways, mostly operated by volunteer enthusiasts, providing a tourist attraction for the region. These ones are all in Yorkshire, but there are over 100 in the whole of the UK. Some of them are narrow gauge lines, shown as NG in the text on the screen. The North Yorkshire Moors Railway is probably the best known of our heritage lines in Yorkshire. It runs for 18 miles from Pickering to Gromont and Whitby. The Gromont-Whitby section operates on Network Rail track, in conjunction with the Northern Rail Esk Valley line. The original line opened in 1836, closed in 1967, and reopened as a heritage line in 1973. The fictional television series Heartbeat, which ran for almost 30 years, was filmed in and around Goathland, called Aidensfield in the series. The railway appeared in several episodes of the television series. An annual event at the North York Moors Railway is the War Weekend, where many people attend in World War II uniforms and costumes. Here's a few photos from the event in 2017. The Keighley and Worth Valley Railway also gained fame when the novel The Railway Children was made into a television series and then two films, the first one in 1970. The story was set in Haworth, centred on the railway as it was in the early 20th century. Its author was E. Nesbitt, a Fabian and associate of William Morris. So, to finish the presentation, here is York Station in 2019 with a selection of existing types of trains providing services, mostly diesels. However, here's the latest Azuma train. It looks like the future is electric. And here's a list of the sources of my information for the text and for some of the pictures. And some more. Well, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.